I had a teacher in middle school, an English teacher, and when I complained once that we were reading a book in class that I had already read and I would be bored, he said that reading a book, it's like going into a river. You can never walk into the same river twice. You can never walk into the same book twice. That we change and we grow, and every time we look at a book, we're different, and so the book in some ways is different. Well, having read our Parsha many, many times before, I noticed this year when I was reading an article by another rabbi, something different that I never noticed in the Parsha previously. In chapter 30, verse 37, you can follow along if you want, you don't have to, it's page 348 in the Hertz Chumash. It's talking about what happens in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, and it says that the ark, the altar, shall be most holy, and whatever touches the altar will become holy. Yikdash. That whatever touches it will become holy. And what the rabbi suggested was that there's actually a concept in the Torah that holiness, sacredness, is something that's contagious. We're probably familiar with the idea in the Torah and in Jewish law and halakha that something that's impure, and impurity is contagious. It spreads. Right? Someone who has the disease of, right, we often translate it as leprosy, although it's not really leprosy in the Bible, in the Hebrew scriptures, right? That can spread from person to person, from tent to tent by contact. When somebody dies and passes away, coming in contact with the corpse transfers a level of halachic impurity, ritual impurity to a person. Even the items in the house where the person passes are coming into contact, right, going into under the same roof. That's why we see at Benjamin's and at Steele's, at the chapels and the memorial chapels, there's a separate room for the Kohanim, for descendants of the priests, to stand under a physically different roof, because they can't be under the same roof as a body, as the deceased. So there's this idea that impurity transfers, that it's contagious. But the idea that holiness can transfer as contagious is not something we think of. Although, there are actually 4 verses in the Torah in which it talks about it. There's our verse in our Parsha. There's another one that'll be in next week's Parsha, where it talks about the utensils in the tabernacle. Whoever touches the furnishings shall be, or whatever touches the furnishings shall become sacred. Again, Yikdash. There's an idea of the meal offerings we find later on in the book of Vayikra. Anything that touches the meal offerings will become holy. And also in the same book, the sin offerings. Anything that touches its flesh, the flesh of the sin offerings, Yikdash, will become holy. There's this idea that just contact can pass holiness. So it ends up being that that's not how it's codified in Jewish law. The rabbis de-emphasize this. But it's interesting that a few of the rabbinic commentaries do notice it. Most of the rabbinic commentaries reinterpret these verses and say that it's actually a commandment, that only things that are holy already can touch and come in contact, right, with these sacred objects here in the Mishkan. But on the simple level of just reading the Parshiot, reading the Torah text, the Pshat, right, that seems to be a play on what's really happening. The Torah seems to say that sacredness, holiness, is contagious, can be transferred. And so one of the rabbis, even Ezra, accepts this. But what he points out is that, well, it does transfer. He says it transfers to a lesser degree than impurity. Sanctity transfers to a lesser degree. And there's something really interesting in that, I think. The rabbi who wrote the article I was reading, Rabbi Professor Marty Lokshin, actually a professor emeritus at York University, lives in Jerusalem now. But he ends his article by pointing out that even Ezra emphasizes this idea that holiness is contagious, but impurity is much more contagious, and that's a good lesson for all of us. And that's a lesson I think is really interesting. That even if holiness is contagious, impurity is more contagious. The question is, what does that really mean? There's a question people get asked sometimes in interviews, or a type of question. When you're applying for a job, depending on what the job is, they might ask you a question like, what percentage of people do you think steal from their employers? Right? And what's the reason for a question like that? If you answer something really low, you probably don't hang out with a lot of people that steal from their employers. Or you probably haven't done it yourself, because if you did, you might justify it that everyone does it, so I can do it. I can take some pens home, some paper, maybe a cell phone, some money, whatever it is. If you give a high number, you say 90% of people, 80% of people steal from their employers, it means either you probably are someone who's stolen from a place where you work, and you're trying to justify it, or you hang out with a lot of people that do. And if that's the case, bad behavior is contagious, right? You might start to do it yourself, even if you haven't yet. And it's telling to them. So if you ever get a question like that in an interview, you know what the right answer is, okay? It's a practical sermon this week. But research shows that this is true. One study found that a person's chance of becoming obese increased by over 50%. Over 50% if a very close friend of theirs was someone who was obese. It was over 40% if a sibling was obese. Right? The people we surround ourselves with, the people that we interact with, have an impact on us. And there's lots of different studies that show this. But we don't need modern studies to show this. Our tradition tells us this long, long ago. In his Sefer Midot, his book about values, character traits, the Rambam, Maimonides, over 1,000 years ago, he wrote that there's two things you should do if you're trying to develop better character traits. One is stop hanging out with people who have bad character traits. And two is hang around people who have the traits you want to embody. Right? 1,000 years ago, he didn't need studies to prove it. He knew and understood the people we surround ourselves with influence us. The people in our social networks, in our circles, in our communities, they impact us. And that, I think, is the lesson that Rabbi Lokshin wants us to take from our Parsha this week. And it's an important lesson, and one that I want us all to take as well. Even if holiness is transferable, and it is, if we surround ourselves with people that act with the values that we want to embody, that are the type of people we want to be, we'll take on those qualities. If we surround ourselves with acts, it's what Jewish law is so great about. By making us think and pause throughout our day and think about God and think about mitzvah and think about commandedness and think about Torah and tradition and our place in the world and our link in history, all throughout the day. From the time you wake up until you put your head back on your pillow, there is halachically something you're supposed to be doing. Jewish law talks about which shoe you should put on first and which one you should tie first. Right? What you say before you eat, what you say after you eat, what you eat. How we should speak to people. It talks about which times in the day we should pray and what are the words we should be saying. But all of those moments of observance are moments of reminding us of the qualities we want to embody, putting us back on track of thinking about the people we want to be, the lessons we want to not just learn or say we follow, but the lessons we really want to live by. But it takes a lot of work. The first step is to stay away from impurity. But that sometimes is a difficult step, but the easier one. Because impurity transfers a lot easier than holiness. So this Shabbat, I invite us to think about the people in our lives we want to maybe spend a little more time with, the people that have the qualities we want to embody, the qualities we want to live by. And invite us to also think about our tradition. And I'm not saying you have to start davening 3 times a day, or you have to worry about which shoe you put on first in the morning and which one you tie first. But maybe we can each take a part of our day, 5 minutes, or even just 1 minute, and devote that to something Jewish if we don't already. And if we do, maybe take 2 minutes or 3 minutes. Try to add a little bit more of the values that we live by. The lessons of our Torah, the lessons of our parents, our grandparents, going back generations, aren't just lessons we read about here on Saturday mornings, but lessons that really are a part of our life and a part of who we are. Start your day with a prayer of thanks and gratitude. It's in the Siddur. It's easy. When you put your head on your pillow, take a moment to think about the people you want to forgive, and you might want to let go of some anger towards them. It's in the Siddur. It's easy. Or before you eat, take a moment to just be appreciative that we have food and others don't. The blessings in our lives and where they come from. Holiness is contagious, but a little bit less so than the other side of things. So if we want to live a life of meaning, we want to live a life of something special, something sacred, we have to take extra efforts to surround ourselves with such things. Shabbat Shalom.